TVMS is an untimed test for visual motor skills for subjects 3 to 13 years of age. This can be administered to individuals or small groups. While there is no time limit, administration time is generally 10 minutes, depending on the age of the subject for all 23 test stimuli. Response is by copying geometric designs. In addition to the test manual, components of the test include a test booklet, a criterion booklet that accompanies each test booklet, and a protractor. The examiner should start with a warm and friendly greeting. The examiner should emphasize to the subject not to be concerned about how he or she performs, but of course, the examiner should encourage the subject to do his or her very best, even though the designs become more difficult as one works along through the test. When it is determined by the examiner that the subject feels comfortable, the examiner can proceed slowly in giving the directions to the subject. In addition, it is necessary to prod a subject to draw all the signs. The examiner should offer the subject as much assistance as possible, such as turning the pages of the test booklet for the very young subject, prefacing each design with encouragement to draw the design as well as possible. The examiner should also make every effort to keep the subject's attention and concentration on the matter copying the design. Examiner should give the directions in a firm voice and at the speed that will easily understood by subjects of all ages. These instructions may be used for administration to individuals or to groups. Say to the subject, "I want you to listen very carefully to what I am going to say to you." Then proceed to explaining to the subject what to do. Say to the subject, "I want you to copy some designs with your pencil." Now turn the page to the first design, which is a circle. Now take your pencil and draw this circle and copy this circle in the space below the design. If the subject draws or copies the circle correctly, explain to the subject that he or she is to draw or copy many more designs in the booklet. That neither erasing nor sketching nor second attempts are allowed, nor is the use of aids allowed in drawing lines, circles, and so on. It is permissible but not recommended for the subject to rework or overwork lines or dots. Since the subject is not given an example, he or she may not immediately grasp the idea of copying the circle. The examiner should demonstrate the motor movement by tracing the circle with his or her index finger. Then, have the subject do the same, eventually using a pencil. It should be made clear that the subject should not draw over the circle, but should copy it in the space provided. When the subject understands, proceed with the testing. No other demonstration are allowed. The scoring of TVMS is neither difficult nor complicated nor time-consuming, but it is definitive in measuring a subject's visual motor skills or lack of visual motor skills. The aim of this method of scoring a subject's copied designs is to give a more accurate assessment of the subject's visual motor skills or lack of skills. To expedite scoring, examiners should peruse each copied design before scoring, becoming familiar with the design to determine immediately the errors and actions. The scoring criterion booklet not only provides types of error characteristics, the number of classifications, the methods of scoring possible errors, but also provides accuracy characteristics. The subject is given a score of 0 for any one or a number of error characteristics for each geometric design, and a score of 1 for any one or a number of accuracy characteristics for each geometric design. The purpose of TVPSR is to determine the subject's visual perceptual strengths and weaknesses based on non-motor visual perceptual testing. This test measures 7 visual perceptual skills, such as visual discrimination, visual memory, visual spatial relationships, visual form constancy, visual sequential memory, visual figure ground, and visual closure. Before the test begins, the examiner should provide a friendly atmosphere and establish a warm rapport with the subject. It is wise to explain to the subject what the examiner expects of him or her in relation to the test. The examiner should always explain the directions and instructions at a level the subject can understand, but more important is that these instructions and directions be repeated as much as necessary for the subjects to be fully informed of how to perform the test. After, the examiner should be assured that the subject understands the directions. The examiner should proceed with administering the test. It is always well for examiners to determine from the subject's performance of the examples if the subject is fully aware of how to perform the test. The direction should be given to the subject in a well-articulated voice and at a speed that is easily understood. Since this test is untimed and individually administered, the examiner should proceed slowly with the flipping of the plates. The examiner should flip the plates at a rate that it is set by the subject. It is possible for the subject to take longer than what seems necessary. Therefore, the examiner should prod the subject to give his or her response. For visual discrimination, state to the subject, "Look at this form," while pointing to the single form above the 5 forms on plate A. Then say to the subject, "Find among the 5 forms below," while pointing to the 5 forms below. If the subject determines the correct response, continue with this test until the ceiling is reached. If the subject cannot determine the answer to plate A, point to the correct form, explain the proper answer, and mark on the record form the number corresponding to the subject's incorrect response. Have the subject continue this test until he or she fails 4 out of 5 consecutive items. It may be necessary to prod the subject to make a choice if the subject takes more time than what would be considered reasonable. For visual memory, state to the subject, "Look at this form and remember it so that you can find it on another page," while pointing to this form, which is a single item on plate A. Then, say to the subject after you have turned the page, "Find it among these forms." If the subject determines the correct response, continue with this test until the ceiling is reached. If the subject cannot determine the answer to plate A, point to the correct form, explain the proper answer, and mark on the proper place on the record form the number corresponding to the subject's incorrect response. Have the subject continue this subtest until he or she fails 4 out of 5 consecutive items. While it is difficult to establish a definite time allowance for the subject to view the signs, it was found in the development of this subtest that 4 to 5 seconds would be ample for the older subjects, but 8 seconds should be used for the younger subjects. Examiners should gauge time by mentally counting 1,000 for each second. A stopwatch can be used, but it may be too distracting to the subject. Some subjects may not need the allotted time, therefore proceed at their pace. For visual spatial relationships, state to the subject while pointing to the forms on plate A, "Here are some forms that are the same, but one form is going a different way or part of one of the forms is going a different way." If the subject determines the correct response, continue with this test until the ceiling is reached. If the subject cannot determine the answer to plate A, point to the correct form, explain the proper answer, and mark on the record form the number corresponding to the subject's incorrect response. Have the subject continue this test until he or she fails 4 out of 5 consecutive items. For visual form constancy, state to the subject, look at this form while pointing to the single form above the other 5 forms on plate A. Then say to the subject, find this form among the 5 forms even though it may be smaller, bigger, darker, turned, or upside down. If the subject determines the correct response, continue with this subtest until the ceiling is reached. If the subject cannot determine the answer to plate A, point to the correct form, explain the proper answer, and mark on the record form the number corresponding to the subject's incorrect response. Have the subject continue this subtest until he or she fails 4 out of 5 consecutive items. On those plates where there are a number of forms within a frame that have similar characteristics as the stimulus, have the subject point with his or her finger to his or her specific choice. For visual sequential memory, state to the subject, look at these forms very closely, while pointing to the forms of plate A. Emphasize to the subject, remember this form so that you can find it among other forms. Then, turn the page and say to the subject, find among these forms. After the subject has determined the correct form, say to him that these forms are going to get longer, further encouraging him to remember the exact sequence. If the subject determines the correct response, continue with this subtest until the ceiling is reached. If the subject cannot determine the answer to plate A, point to the correct form, explain the proper answer, and mark the record form the number corresponding to the subject's incorrect response. Have the subject continue this subtest until he or she fails 3 out of 4 consecutive items. Based on the time limits used in the development of these subtests, examiners can allow an increase of time as the sequence of forms increases. 2 to 3 forms in sequence, 5 seconds. 4 to 5 forms in sequence, 9 seconds. 6 to 7 forms in sequence, 12 seconds. 8 to 9 forms in sequence, 14 seconds. It may be necessary to prod a subject to make a choice if the subject takes more time than what would be considered reasonable. Examiners can gauge time by mentally counting 1,000 for each second. A stopwatch can be used, but it may be too distracting to the subject. Some subjects may not need the allotted time, therefore proceed at their pace. For visual figured ground, state to the subject, look at this form while pointing on the plate A. Then say to the subject, look at the forms below. Saying further, find the exact or same form from among these forms below. Emphasizing to the subject that the form is hidden and that he or she will have to look very closely. If the subject determines the correct response, continue with this subtest until the ceiling is reached. If the subject cannot determine the answer to plate A, point to the correct form, explain the proper answer, and mark the record form the number corresponding to the subject's incorrect response. Have the subject continue this subtest until he or she fails 3 out of 4 consecutive items. For visual closure, state to the subject, look at this form, while pointing to the completed form on plate A. Then say to the subject, look at these figures below which are incomplete, while pointing to these forms. Ask the subject to point to the one form that would be like the form above if completed. If the subject determines the correct response, continue with this subtest until the ceiling is reached. If the subject cannot determine the answer to plate A, point to the correct form, explain the proper answer, and mark on the record form the number corresponding to the subject's incorrect response. Have the subject continue this subtest until he or she fails 3 out of 4 consecutive items. Once raw scores are determined for each subtest and entered in the score box on the record form, derived scores can be obtained. 3 types of scores are available on the TVPSR. There are standard scores, percentile ranks, and perceptual ages.